that then is totally violating the principles established in our Constitution of having the individual being the sovereign over the government. This makes the government sovereign over the individual. Diametrically opposed. Totally reverses it. Now, they had been trying, as I said, all through the 1970s to pass federal land use regulation, which would have done that to the entire country. But they couldn't succeed. This succeeded, and it succeeded very well. Why? Because you had a majority in New York City basically dictating what happened in a small, low-density area in the Adirondack State Park. Politically, it was carried forth by the city of New York and the New York Times. I have done a thorough documentation of all of this. And they have tried, the people that have tried everything they can to break the back of this, and it succeeded through today. It was so successful that all the efforts since that time were modeled after the Adirondack State Park regulations. Agenda 21 was spawned in this particular act in 1971. So it started within the park. In 1976, the United Nations Habitat 1 said that property must be controlled by the state. Basically, they set a policy that establishes the fact that the government must control property rights, all property rights within the nation. In 1986 was the creation of the Columbia River Gorge Scenic Area, which was another example of the Adirondack State Park along both sides of the Columbia River between Oregon and Washington. In 1993, attempt to create the Interior Columbia Basin Ecosystem Management project called Ice Bump. I was quite involved in that, covering this entire area of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and Nevada, and a little bit of Utah. People rejected it. Just like we did here in Maine when the Northern Forest Lands attempt over all of northern Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. You remember the Northern Forest Land study? That's what it was trying to do. And the people rejected it. It's still there. It's still on the shelf. It still can be reactivated. But because the people stood up and said no, they could not implement it. And then finally, the creation of the Escalante Grand Staircase National Monument by Bill Clinton, President Clinton, back in 1995. You remember, if you remember back, he was on the south rim of the Grand Canyon signing this particular landmark designation, which coincidentally literally stopped the development of the biggest clean coal deposit in the world. And he had just gotten a big contribution from an Indonesian who also owned the second biggest clean coal deposit in the world. You see, what happens is that the whole system starts to get corrupt when you have this much power. I'll give you some more examples as we go along. Who are the NGOs that are not NGOs? For those of you who don't know, are non-governmental organizations. They're the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, so forth. The American Planning Association, there's two organizations, there's a bunch of sub ones, but two big ones. The American Planning Association, I'll talk more about them later, and the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, called ICLEI. It's now called the Local Governments for Sustainability. ICLEI and the American Planning Association, the APA, are joined at the hip. You'll see them intermingling their affairs at all levels at all times. Now here's ICLEI right off of their webpage a month or so ago. Their global programs. Now they will tell you they have adamantly denied that they have any international links back to the Agenda 21 and the United Nations activities. They will absolutely refute it, and here it is right on their website. The international goals. This approach links local action to internationally agreed upon goals and targets such as Agenda 21. The United Nations Framework of the Convention on Climate Change, Biological Diversity, Convention on Combat Desertification, the Habitat Agenda that I mentioned a moment ago, Johannesburg Plan of Implementation. I was at that meeting in South Africa. They're involved at every level of the United Nations agenda to implement the United Nations plan at the local level. And Falmouth, Portland, Wisconsin, I believe, several more of our southern Maine cities are members of ICLEI and are falling right into the trap. This is the Habitat 1 conference on May 31st to June 11th, 1976. There's a whole page on this. I'm just going to give you the highlights. This is the plan now, the core of the United Nations plans. All of their treaties, all of their agreements and so forth are based upon this. The provision of decent dwellings and healthy conditions for the people can only be achieved if land is used in the interest of society as a whole. Public control of land use is therefore indispensable. It permeates everything that the United Nations does and everything the United Nations agrees to at the national level, whatever nation is involved. So understand that this concept of private property rights literally is backwards from what our founders established in the Constitution, where private property rights were basically held sacred. Not to the point where they can cause, I get nailed on this, so I want to make this clear. There are justifications for controlling private property rights when safety or the value of adjacent property owners is at stake. In other words, a landowner cannot throw trash on his neighbor's land, and he cannot do activities that hurt his neighbor or the community. That's been that way since the Magna Carta. It's never changed. This idea that a property owner can do anything that they want to is just not true. However, our Constitution is based on and especially the Maine Constitution, is based on the principle that an individual is free to do with their property what they want to do, free from government encroachment, unless it harms safety or health.
How's that working for us?
Yeah, right. Now, this was in 1993. This was after the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, but before the Biodiversity Treaty was actually ratified, or attempted to be ratified. It never was fully ratified. This is what the EPA said, and there's internal working documents in every agency that say something to this effect. The executive branch should direct federal agencies to evaluate national policies in light of international policies and obligations, and to amend national policies to achieve international objectives. So here you have a federal agency, in fact all of them are doing this, and I'll explain how and why in just a moment, that were literally changing without going to Congress at all their primary goals and objectives for that agency, to align themselves with international goals and policies rather than U.S. law. That brings us to Agenda 21 then. What is Agenda 21? Agenda 21 is a 40-chapter document. It's soft law, can't be enforced on anyone. And by the way, we stopped the ability for it to be enforceable in 2002 in Johannesburg, South Africa. But it basically, if you read it, it controls every aspect of every single person on planet Earth 100% of the time. It is mind-boggling if it were ever fully implemented. Of course, it never will be. But the key factor is that it is designed basically to tell you what you can and cannot do, when you can do it, who can do it, and so forth, to manage land, to build an office, whatever the case might be. It is astonishing. 40 chapters. Now, Agenda 21 was introduced to the world in 1992. It had been developing for about 10 years. And President Clinton created the President's Council on Sustainable Development in 1993, made up of 24 people, over half of whom belonged to the IUCN. Are you seeing how all this is coming together? In 1996, they wrote and published what's called Sustainable America. And it basically takes the United Nations Agenda 21 goals and puts them into U.S. policy. And it starts out by saying the future progress requires that the United States broaden its commitment to environmental protection to embrace the essential components of sustainable development. Remember, the IUCN coined the word sustainable development, and it's based on the religious belief of pantheism. Whoops, I wasn't supposed to do that. Anyway, let's go on. Now, the United Nations Agenda 21, Chapter 7, Promoting Sustainable Human Settlements. Remember, there are 40 chapters. This is just this one, and it's just a small segment of this one. Improve human settlement management. Now, we need to manage our towns and cities and so forth. I mean, you just can't let chaos reign. But they mean far more than just that. What they mean is to micromanage all development and so forth. In subsection 16A, adopting and applying urban management guidelines in the areas of land management, urban environmental management, infrastructure management, and municipal finance and administration. Pretty much covers it. It promotes sustainable land use planning and management. Something that, of course, the Gateway 1 project is designed to do. In section 7.30A, establish as appropriate national legislation to guide the implementation of public policies for environmentally sound urban development, land utilization, housing, and for the improved management of urban expansion. In other words, legislation that would do that. That's what they tried to do basically in the 1970s and failed. And so they knew they couldn't do it yet to the American people. They still could not get a bill through Congress. So what they did is to enable to improve this management of urban expansion, they created comprehensive planning, smart growth.